What if a single sentence, written by a man who had never set foot in Latin America, decided the fate of an entire continent for the next 2 centuries? That sentence was spoken in 1823, and the wars, invasions, dictators, and disappeared bodies it left behind are still being counted today. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which other historical doctrine or political strategy you would like us to explore in the next video. Now, let's travel back to the moment when the most powerful idea in the history of the Western Hemisphere was born. Not on a battlefield, but in a quiet room, written with ink and ambition. Imagine the year 1823. The world is still trembling from the shockwaves of the Napoleonic Wars. Spain, once the undisputed master of an empire stretching from California to the southern tip of South America, is weakened, broken, and bleeding. One by one, its colonies in Latin America are rising up. Simón Bolívar is marching through Venezuela and Colombia. José de San Martín has already liberated Argentina and Chile. The age of European empire in the Americas is crumbling. And in Washington, a group of men are watching all of this with eyes that are not entirely sympathetic and not entirely selfless. President James Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, understood something that most of their contemporaries had not yet grasped. The collapse of the Spanish Empire was not just a humanitarian story of freedom fighters and liberation. It was a geopolitical vacuum, a power void of historic proportions. And into that void, the great European powers, Britain, France, Russia, were already beginning to lean. They were eyeing the newly independent nations of Latin America the way a hawk eyes an open field. Something had to be said. Something had to be declared. And on December 2nd, 1823, during his annual message to Congress, President Monroe said it. The words were precise, almost cold. The American continents, he declared, were no longer to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Any attempt by a European nation to extend its political system to any portion of the Western Hemisphere would be considered a danger to the peace and safety of the United States. Europe must stay out of the Americas, and the Americas, in return, would stay out of Europe's affairs. At first glance, this sounds almost noble. A young republic standing up for the right of emerging nations to determine their own futures without the interference of old-world monarchies. And in its original form, there was something genuine in that vision. John Quincy Adams, the true intellectual architect behind the doctrine, was deeply suspicious of European imperialism and genuinely believed in a kind of hemispheric solidarity. But there was another dimension to the Monroe Doctrine that was present from the very beginning, even if it was not yet spoken aloud. The United States was not simply saying that Europe had no right to dominate Latin America. It was saying quietly and carefully that the Western Hemisphere was its own sphere of influence, not a collection of free and equal nations. A zone, a neighborhood, and the United States intended to be the landlord. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine existed more as an aspiration than a practical policy. The United States in 1823 was not a global power. It had a small army, almost no navy to speak of, and was still expanding its own borders westward through purchase, treaty, and war. It could not have enforced the Monroe Doctrine militarily even if it had wanted to. Ironically, it was the British Royal Navy that actually kept European colonizers at bay during much of the 19th century. Not because Britain agreed with Monroe, but because Britain also had an interest in keeping other European powers out of Latin American markets. So the doctrine floated through the decades, invoked occasionally, mostly symbolic, a statement of principle more than a declaration of power. But then came the 1890s, and everything changed. The United States had finished its westward expansion. The frontier, which had defined American identity for a century, was closing. The country's industrial output was exploding. Its steel mills, railroads, and factories were producing more than the domestic market could absorb. American businessmen, industrialists, and politicians began to look outward. They needed new markets, new places to invest, new territories to project power into. And they looked south to the Caribbean to Central America, to South America, and they saw opportunity. The Monroe Doctrine, which had always been a declaration, was about to become a tool. The first major test came in 1895 during a dispute between Venezuela and British Guiana over a border. Britain, asserting what it believed to be its sovereign right over a colonial territory, refused to submit the matter to arbitration. Secretary of State Richard only sent a diplomatic note to London that stunned the British government. He declared, bluntly, that the United States was practically sovereign on this continent and that its fiat was law upon the subjects to which it confined its interposition. The Monroe Doctrine, only argued, gave the United States not just the right but the obligation to intervene in any dispute involving a Latin American nation and a European power. Britain, after some deliberation, agreed to arbitration, and in Washington, the lesson was absorbed with satisfaction. The doctrine had teeth. Now, someone just needed to be willing to bite. That someone arrived in 1901, and he arrived with enormous energy, theatrical confidence, and a philosophy of power that would leave a permanent mark on the entire hemisphere. Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States after the assassination of William McKinley, and from his very first days in office, it was clear that this was a man who believed in force the way other men believed in prayer. He was physically imposing, intellectually restless, and possessed of an almost operatic sense of destiny. He had charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He had hunted grizzly bears in the wilderness. He wrote history books and read philosophy between diplomatic meetings. And he had a phrase that he loved, a phrase he attributed to a West African proverb, though historians have never been able to confirm that origin. Speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far. The big stick. That phrase became the name of an era. Roosevelt's approach to Latin America was built on a simple and brutal logic. The nations of the Caribbean and Central America were, in his view, often unstable. They defaulted on their debts to European banks. They experienced coups, revolutions, and political chaos. And when they did, European creditors came knocking, sometimes with warships. In 1902 and 1903, Germany, Britain, and Italy had actually blockaded Venezuela and bombarded its ports to force the repayment of debts. Roosevelt watched this and drew a conclusion. If the United States did not police the hemisphere, European powers would do it for them. And European military presence in the Americas was precisely what the Monroe Doctrine had been designed to prevent. So in 1904, Roosevelt added something to the Monroe Doctrine, something that would become known as the Roosevelt Corollary. He declared that in cases of chronic wrongdoing or impotence on the part of a Latin American nation, cases that invited foreign intervention, the United States had the right, even the duty, to exercise an international police power. The United States would not just keep Europe out. It would go in itself. It would manage the finances, restore order, supervise elections, train armies, and run governments when it judged that the nations in question were incapable of doing so themselves. In practice, this meant that the sovereignty of Latin American nations was conditional. They were free, as long as they remained stable, paid their debts, protected foreign investments, and kept order in ways that satisfied Washington. The moment they failed those tests, the big stick came out. And the big stick was used again and again and again across decades, across borders, across generations of Latin American men and women who never asked for the United States to come. Cuba was the first great laboratory. After the Spanish-American War of 1898, the island won its formal independence from Spain, but found itself almost immediately under a new kind of control. The Platt Amendment, inserted into the Cuban Constitution under American pressure, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it judged that Cuban independence or the protection of life, property, and individual liberty was threatened. The United States occupied Cuba militarily in 1906, again in 1912, and again in 1917. American businesses poured into the island, buying up sugar plantations, tobacco estates, and utilities. Havana became a playground for American tourists and investors. And Cuban political life was shaped, distorted, and constrained by the knowledge that Washington was always watching and always capable of sending in the Marines. Panama is perhaps the most audacious story of all. In 1903, the United States wanted to build a canal through the narrow isthmus connecting North and South America. The most logical route ran through the Colombian province of Panama. Colombia's Senate rejected the treaty that would have permitted the project. Roosevelt was furious. He later described the Colombian senators as contemptible little creatures and bandits. He was not willing to wait for negotiation. Within weeks of Colombia's rejection, a revolt broke out in Panama. Panamanian separatists, with the knowledge and material support of the United States, declared independence. American warships positioned in the waters around the isthmus prevented Colombian troops from reaching the province to suppress the rebellion. Within days, the United States recognized the new Republic of Panama. Within 2 weeks, a new treaty was signed giving the United States the right to build and control the canal and a zone 10 miles wide on either side of it, in perpetuity. The Panamanian independence movement had been midwifed by Washington, and the new nation was, from its birth, something between an ally and a protectorate. Construction of the Panama Canal began almost immediately. It opened in 1914 and became one of the great engineering achievements of the century, and one of the great symbols of American power over the hemisphere. Nicaragua tells a different and darker story. The United States sent Marines to Nicaragua in 1912 and kept them there, with only a brief interruption until 1933. For more than 2 decades, American military forces occupied a sovereign nation. They supervised elections. They trained and commanded the Nicaragua National Guard. They protected American business interests, particularly those of the United Fruit Company and the banking houses of New York that had lent money to the Nicaraguan government. The occupation was not popular. A guerrilla leader named Augusto Cesar Sandino refused to accept it and spent years fighting the Marines in the mountains and jungles of northern Nicaragua with a force of peasants and volunteers. He became a legend throughout Latin America, the man who dared to stand up and say no. The United States never defeated him militarily. In 1933, when the Marines finally withdrew, they left behind the National Guard, now under the command of Anastasio Somoza Garcia. In 1934, Somoza's forces captured Sandino after a peace dinner and executed him. 2 years later, Somoza staged a coup and established a dynastic dictatorship that would rule Nicaragua for the next 4 decades. This was, in a sense, the true legacy of the Big Stick. Not direct occupation, but the cultivation of local strongmen who could maintain order and protect American interests after the Marines went home. Haiti is perhaps the most tragic chapter. In 1915, following years of political instability and the murder of a Haitian president by a mob, the United States sent Marines to occupy the island nation. They stayed for 19 years. During that time, they restructured Haiti's finances, took control of its customs revenues, built roads and schools and sanitation systems, and also dissolved the Haitian legislature when it refused to ratify a new constitution that would allow foreign ownership of land. They forced Haitians to perform corvée labor, essentially unpaid forced work, to build the infrastructure they had planned. They imposed martial law. They suppressed a peasant rebellion called the Cacos with considerable violence, killing thousands. By the time the occupation ended in 1934, Haiti had a newly trained military force, the gendarmerie, that would eventually be used not to protect the Haitian people, but to dominate them. The poverty, instability, and authoritarian governance that have marked Haiti ever since cannot be separated from the 2 decades of American occupation and the systems it left behind. The Dominican Republic experienced 2 separate American occupations, one from 1916 to 1924 and another later in the century. In the first occupation, American naval officers administered the country directly, collected its customs revenues, and trained a national constabulary. When they left, that constabulary was taken over by a man named Rafael Trujillo, who used it to establish one of the most ruthless and personalistic dictatorships in the history of the hemisphere. Trujillo ruled for 31 years with an iron hand, ordering massacres, torturing opponents, and maintaining absolute control through fear. For years, Washington tolerated and even supported him because he was reliably anti-communist and friendly to American business. He was, as the phrase went, a bastard, but he was their bastard. Across all of these interventions, a pattern emerges that is too consistent to be coincidental. The United States went in when there was instability or the threat of it. It reorganized finances and governments. It trained local security forces. And when it left, it departed not into a vacuum, but into the arms of men who had learned from American trainers and American institutions how to use organized violence to maintain power. The dictators who followed the American Marines, Somoza in Nicaragua, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, successive strongmen in Haiti, were not aberrations. They were, in many ways, products of the system the United States had helped create. And the ordinary people of Latin America understood this, even when their governments could not say it openly. Throughout the first decades of the 20th century, a powerful and growing movement of anti-American sentiment swept through the intelligentsia, the labor movements, and the political parties of the region. Poets wrote about the empire to the north with fury and grief. José Martí, the Cuban revolutionary hero, had warned before his death in 1895 that he had lived inside the monster and knew its entrails. The Uruguayan philosopher José Enrique Rodo published a book called Ariel in 1900, in which he contrasted the soulless materialism of North American civilization with the humanistic, spiritual inheritance of Latin culture. These were not just literary exercises. They were cries of resistance from people who felt that their sovereignty, their dignity, and their destiny were being managed by a foreign power that did not respect them as equals. The international community noticed too. At the 6th International Conference of American States, held in Havana in 1928, the delegation of El Salvador proposed a resolution declaring that no state has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another. The United States delegation rejected it, but the pressure was building. Even within the United States, voices were beginning to question whether the big stick was producing the results it promised, or whether it was, at enormous human cost, simply making the hemisphere more resentful and less stable than it would otherwise have been. The answer, when it finally came, arrived through the policy of a man who is usually remembered for other things. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Theodore, took office in 1933 with a different vision of how the United States should relate to its southern neighbors. He called it the good neighbor policy. Under this new approach, the United States renounced, at least formally, the right of unilateral intervention in Latin America. The Platt Amendment was abrogated. The last Marines left Haiti and Nicaragua. Roosevelt went to Montevideo and sat across the table from Latin American diplomats and agreed that no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. For a moment, it seemed as though the era of the big stick was truly over. But history rarely ends cleanly. The structures of economic domination, the investments, the debt arrangements, the banking relationships remained in place. American corporations continued to exercise enormous influence over the politics and economies of Central America and the Caribbean. And when the Cold War began after the Second World War, the United States found new justifications for old habits. The threat of communism replaced the threat of European colonialism as the reason why Washington reserved the right to manage the affairs of its neighbors. Governments that nationalized industries or redistributed land or allied with labor unions were labeled communist threats and subjected to covert and overt pressure. Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Brazil in 1964, Chile in 1973. The interventions continued, sometimes through the Central Intelligence Agency rather than the Marines, but the logic was the same logic that Theodore Roosevelt had articulated in 1904. The United States believed it had the right, indeed the responsibility, to decide what was acceptable governance in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine and the Big Stick policy were not simply episodes of historical imperialism that belonged to the past. They were the founding architecture of a relationship, a relationship between the most powerful nation in the hemisphere and all the others, that was defined not by equality or partnership, but by hierarchy and control. Latin American nations entered the 20th century as nominally independent republics with their own constitutions and flags and presidents. But their political life, their economic structures, and their security forces were shaped again and again by the decisions made in Washington. Decisions made by people who viewed the hemisphere as a zone of interest rather than a community of equals. The human cost of that architecture was staggering. The years of occupation produced not stability, but strongmen. The strongmen produced not prosperity, but terror. The terror produced not loyalty, but resistance. And the resistance produced, in country after country, cycles of repression and rebellion that cost hundreds of thousands of lives across the 20th century. The disappeared of Argentina, the death squads of El Salvador, the Contras of Nicaragua, the tortured of Chile. These stories have complex causes and complex histories, but the thread that runs through them, the thread of American power, shaping, distorting, and often destroying the political life of the hemisphere, is not invisible to those who live through it. The Monroe Doctrine told Europe to stay out. The Big Stick policy told Latin America to behave. And behind both of those declarations was an assumption so deeply embedded in American political thought that it was rarely examined openly. The assumption that the United States had a special right, rooted in geography and power and national destiny, to determine the shape of the world it lived in. That assumption did not die with the Cold War. It did not die with the Good Neighbor policy or the Alliance for Progress or any of the other rebranding efforts that American administrations periodically attempted. It is still present today in debates about immigration and trade and sovereignty and the treatment of nations that choose paths Washington does not approve. The story of the Monroe Doctrine is not finished. It is in many ways the story of where we are now, living in the long shadow of a sentence spoken in 1823 by a man who looked an entire continent and decided it belonged, in some essential way, to the nation he represented. Whether that sentence was a declaration of protection or a declaration of dominance depends on where you were standing when you heard it. From Washington, it sounded like a shield. From Havana, from Managua, from Port-au-Prince, from Santiago, it sounded like something else entirely. These are not just footnotes in a history textbook. Behind every treaty, every marine landing, every installed dictator, there were real people, farmers, teachers, mothers, children, whose lives were upended by decisions made thousands of miles away. History does not belong only to the powerful. It belongs to everyone who lived through it, who resisted it, and who refuses to forget what was done in the name of security, stability, and a national interest. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see something you had never seen before, hit subscribe right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what we uncover next. Leave a comment below telling us which chapter of hidden history you want us to open next. Every like, every share, every subscription helps this channel bring stories like this one to more people who deserve to know them. We will see you in the next video.